Hello, everybody, and welcome to CPAC 2024 on Broadcast Row. I'm joined by Julio Rosas today, field reporter. Julio, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
There's so many national security threats today, specifically at the border. What do you make of what's currently going on right now? What are you seeing down there?
Well, it's just on anything like we've ever seen historically when it comes to the border. So the border, just to make it clear, the border has never been perfect. It never will be perfect, right? But obviously, there could be steps taken to make it more secure, make it more safe, and really hurt the criminal organizations that work on both sides. Um, just on the human flow of people that have been coming since the Biden administration, that was caused by the Biden administration. There's a lot of things that are easy to see, and then the things that are harder to see. And things that are harder to see is what worries me the most, and it worries anybody who knows about the border the most, because when we talk about the historic number of people that have been caught at the southern border who are on some terror watch list, uh, they usually find those people, not all the time, but they usually find those people that are trying to avoid apprehension, not necessarily uh, giving themselves up easily. Usually, those are the family units. Although increasingly, we're seeing single adult males also willingly hand themselves over. So that's another disturbing trend. But the fact that an Al Shabaab terrorist actually did give himself up and was released after being screened, and then they didn't find out about that until a year later. And this is apparently was like a bomb maker. Went to Minneapolis. I wonder why. Um, I mean, that's just crazy. And it shows how when Border Patrol is overwhelmed, they can't do proper screening. It's hard to do normal screening under regular circumstances, because you got when they like, well, they do background checks and everything. It's like, well, do they how are they going to get background checks from countries that we don't have normal relationships with? Like these are countries that barely have a healthcare system sometimes. How are you going to get an accurate criminal record from some of these areas? I mean, so it's crazy that they say like, well, they get screened and everything. And it's like, well, there's a lot more that goes to it that's not really being talked about. And so then, of course, when it comes to the fact that when we have an open border like we do now, I mean, that's just a vulnerability. That is a vulnerability that we don't need to have. You understand what I'm saying?
Sure.
It's so unnecessary. And sure, historically, terrorists of any kind, they don't normally go through the southern border because the cartels don't necessarily want that. But now the cartels are making billions of dollars through human trafficking, human smuggling. So they're more than willing now to take that risk on of like, okay, this guy might be a terrorist, but who cares? Because the U.S. in general is weak. So it's very disturbing. It's very disturbing, and the fact that it's been allowed to happen for 3 years is really unacceptable.
Sure. And so you mentioned disturbing. Speaking of disturbing, you have spent a lot of time on the ground in New York City witnessing Hamas rallies. Why don't you tell us what you're seeing there and what you think is to come?
Yeah. So I understand, especially when it comes to foreign interventions and our place in the world. I understand the conservative mindset of like we should retract that a little bit, and I'm generally agree to that. The problem with when it comes to the Israel Hamas war is that some people, again, they're like, well, we shouldn't spend money, and yes, to a point, because the thing is that a lot of the reason why I go to these protests and to cover them, in places like New York City and even down in Florida, is because there's a lot of Hamas sympathizers here in the United States. So I understand, like, okay, fine, you might not care what's happening in Israel or Gaza, but the thing is, like, there's a lot of people here that do, and they're gonna make it your problem.
Sure.
And so that's why we've seen these people block roads, they try to disrupt airport traffic, trying to do just crazy things. I mean, I was in near Rockefeller Center in November when these Palestinians, pro-Hamas people, decided to protest the Christmas tree lighting ceremony, and they caused like a mini, well, not a mini, they caused like a giant brawl with like families and kids around. The cops used pepper spray because I mean, it got that out of hand. So, the fact of the matter is that people need to be aware that you got to have at least awareness of what's going on overseas, because it is going to affect back here. And unfortunately, the far left is mobilizing again, kind of like what I saw back in 2020. So, it's just crazy how emboldened they've gotten since that year. Because one time I saw a guy getting arrested for attacking a cop. Again, it was in New York City, and then the next day I saw him at another protest because he was already released and he was already out and he had no fear and do it. I mean, so it's just that revolving. So there's like this perfect storm of, and now that we're heading into an election year, I'm not saying like that movement is going to be the impetus to start riots again, but again, it's like the factors are kind of building, and with Donald Trump now being basically the presumptive nominee at this point, I don't know. I don't know. And so when we combine with the restorative justice, progressive justice policies that have been implemented since 2020, and how criminals in general don't face any repercussions, now you combine that with a militarized movement in the United States that is openly supporting terrorism. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. They a lot of them do. They view October 7th as like this victory against colonialism, imperialism, white supremacy, and all this nonsense. So it's like, okay, well, if you support that over there, what are you going to do about that here? Sure. And that's another, and so that's, I mean, when we talk about the border, sure, but there's a lot of internal things here that are happening that people really need to kind of wake up to.
So you mentioned 2020, how that year a lot was exploited because it was an election year, and all of a sudden it's 2024, it's another election year. How do you see the issues that you just mentioned accelerating? One would have to assume it's probably going to get worse. Do you see that happening on the ground?
I do, but the only thing is I don't know what kind of the spark is going to be, and we still have a few more months till November. So the year's just beginning. So because 2020, the reason why it got as crazy as it did was two things. Was because of COVID, because it was still the early days. Trump being in office, and then the spark was George Floyd, right? It's kind of like the it's like the triangle that's needed to make. You need all three components to make a fire, right? So I would say we have two of those components right now. And so the thing that we're kind of missing is the spark, which may or may not come. I'm not saying it's a foregone conclusion, but the fact that we're just kind of like slow rolling and kind of going into it, and it's like we're all kind of expecting it at this point, which is really crazy. It's like, well, it was
sad and crazy, but not unreasonable.
Right, not unreasonable, because like we saw what happened again, because there was very little repercussions for what happened in 2020, and there was a high intensity chaos to go along with that. I saw as much as I could see. But what's been happening since then has been this low intensity breakdown. We're not too far from Washington, D.C., and their murder rate has skyrocketed. The carjackings have skyrocketed. I mean, people's cars are being stolen from inside the secured parking garages of their parking buildings. I mean, it's insane. And, the city council's not doing anything about it. And that's just one example. I mean, you have New York, you have Chicago, you have Los Angeles, you have San Francisco. I mean, things were kind of already in decline pre-2020, but then it just kind of accelerated, and it's willful. It's not that they don't know that these policies aren't working. They know they're not working, and they're still doing it anyway.
So it has to be intentional. I think most people have come to that.
Yeah.
Conclusion.
It is. Oh, it's very much intentional. It's either that or they're stupid beyond belief, which is okay. Maybe not unreasonable to assume for some of them, but
unlikely
for most of them, they know what they're doing, and they want that. And it's very sad because these were once great cities. When I've been to Portland or Seattle or even New York City, people would always say, "Oh, that used to be such a great city. It used to be so great." And for me, being about to be 28 here, I don't see that. My mind can't comprehend like oh, this used to be safe. Like this used to be like a place you could actually like walk through and like enjoy and not be open drug markets, and like I can't like really visualize that because my only reality with these places has just been the automatic decline. So it doesn't need to be this way. Same thing with the border. It doesn't need to be this way, but the people in power, they're choosing that destruction.
So most people have come to that conclusion, as you have. The question that everyone has when they get to that point is, okay, they're doing it on purpose, but why? So what do you believe is the reason for the why?
Well, in general, and this applies to the border and the inner cities, it's just that they hate America. They hate what it stands for. They hate what it represents. Because, again, like taking with the Israel-Hamas thing, all the speakers. I mean, it's crazy because it's easy to find, whenever there's a big political gathering or group gathering, it's easy to find kind of the
counter.
The people that are on the fringe.
Sure.
And people will, and try to like they amplify those voices, right? So look, their side looks bad. But I mean, the speakers at these rallies. I mean, the one in D.C. Back in November. Yeah, back in November, there was a speaker on the main stage just screaming his head off. But he's this anti-cop activist in Atlanta, and he was talking about how basically that what Hamas did was justified because, well, it's against colonialism, and he said that we support whatever they do, we support any efforts to resist and by any means necessary. And he's like, and I do mean by any means necessary. And the crowd cheered. So this isn't some like random guy that like, oh, like we're gonna take this fringe guy and like have it represent the entire group. No, these are people that they put on stage. Like Macklemore was there too. So like this guy shared the stage with Macklemore, and yet there's no. I mean, if that was like if you had like a far right rally like that, they would be all over the place. But like I didn't see any big mentions of that in the mainstream media. So it's just I don't know I don't know why necessarily like they think that this is the way to do it. Because obviously if people have issues with the country, and I'm not saying the country's perfect, but the vision of what they want to replace it with is way worse and way more scarier, and it's just crazy that we're in this position.
Absolutely. So going into 2024, last question before we let you go. If their vision is so crazy that it seems that nobody would ever get behind it, does that concern you, especially when you combine that with the influx of illegal immigrants coming in? What do you think will be the result in 2024?
I don't know, but what I will say, just on the issue of immigration alone, just because it affects so many there's so many second and third, fourth, fifth effects. I mean, we saw a tipping point with that in the cities this past summer. I mean, Eric Adams, like some of these Democrats, either elected or the general populace, like they sound like MAGA Republicans. It's like close the border, we want them all out. You go back to your country. I mean, like these are like black people and Latinos and like places that historically are like deep blue in Chicago. Like they sound like they just come from a Trump rally, but because they see like no, like you're spending all this money on these people that aren't even citizens. They're like, what about us? I mean, even like, look, I'm not for just like government spending willy nilly, but if you're gonna do that, at least spend it for American citizens.
Sure.
Not for necessarily people that just arrive and are abusing the asylum system. So I don't know what I will say that if the election doesn't go a certain way, and the border is allowed to continue to be the way it is for another 4 years, we are screwed.
I think most agree. Julio Rosas, thank you very much for joining us today. We'll be right back from CPAC Broadcast Row.